topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we have not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Before we get into today's program, I am thrilled to announce the registration is open for a fabulous new conference for women for which I'll serve as the MC. It's called Thrive in 25 and is a jam-packed few days in Chicago, June 25th through the 28th, 2025, designed to develop women as whole selves. From bolstering your mindset to your financial acumen to leadership to incorporating nature and art into your life to raise consciousness and much more. Visit thrivein25.com for information and to register. Use my promo code GUSTO, all caps, to gain access to the free books and programs I'll be gifting registrants as well. See you there. Now, getting to today's program, we have with us today Katina Sawyer, a PhD and Associate Professor of Management and Organization in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. She's also co-founder of Worker Being, co-host of the Thriving at Work podcast, and co-author of Leading for Wellness, How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives, which we'll be diving into today. Specifically, we'll be discussing workplace wellness, why it's important, and what's in it for you as a leader to improve it, and then discuss several key behaviors leaders can develop to cultivate wellness in their organizations. She joins us today from Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Sawyer, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. And I just love celebrating, really beautiful things that get put into the world, like this thing right here, right?
Thanks.
And
yes.
as you know, of course, I read it cover to cover. Didn't quite sleep with it, but you're so welcome. You're so welcome. And of course, as I mentioned in our correspondence, there's a lot of things that you're up to in your business, your podcast, your book that aligns a lot with my world. So this
Absolutely.
is going to be a fun conversation. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to step into let's talk about definitions and situating what we're talking about here. So let's talk about what just wellness means first.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, this was something we were interested in when we started writing the book. While wellness has some academic definitions, and actually those take varied forms, so there's not a lot of agreement in the scientific literature of what wellness means either. We feel like when companies say wellness and when employees say wellness, they're not always speaking the same language. And so one of the things that we initially wanted to do in our research for the book was really tack down what does wellness mean to employees when they say they want companies to support their wellness? And what we found is that it had 4 components: a physical component, an emotional component, a mental health component, and a work-life balance component. And those seem to be the things that employees are looking for when they're saying they want organizations to support their wellness.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So crisp. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting about that is when it comes to this idea of wellness, I mean, I remember during the pandemic, Katina, when we started talking about well-being as an important thing that the C-suite leaders were focused on. And I thought, oh, this is good. We haven't been talking about this for quite some ever, have we? Even the Gallup organization went from engagement to well-being. And I thought that was a really good thing. And then, something happened. I don't know. So I'm so happy to see that you are advancing this initiative and you've got resources and you're putting this out into the world, because I think it's sorely needed and important. And I think it got sort of sent to the back seat again.
Yeah, I think specifically certain components of wellness got sent to the back seat. At the time of the pandemic, people were emotionally suffering quite a lot and having a lot of authentic and vulnerable conversations. And then it was kind of like companies wanted to put Pandora back in the box,
Right.
We're just going to forget that happened and move forward and readopt our old norms. And that doesn't work. Like, once the cat's out of that bag, it's really hard to go backwards, right? And so while we still see companies spending money on workplace wellness initiatives and doing step challenges and things like that, which aren't bad in and of themselves, certain components, the tougher components, the components that are actually about changing the norms of our workplace, seem to have been pushed back to the back burner, as you're suggesting.
Which is really, this conversation is really exciting for me, Katina, because I really am. I'm a future of work sort of researcher. I'm a social scientist. I care about work being a place where people can see it as experience it as a playground and not a soul crushing place that they have to go to get their paycheck. So, and I have seen that gap between how the workforce has evolved, in part because of what's been catalyzed in the pandemic, but yet, unfortunately, our companies and much of our leadership is still, there's a gap between those two domains.
100%. Yeah, I think we are really held on to these sticky norms that we talk about in the book called ideal worker norms, and those norms were actually derived back in time when employees had more focused spheres between work and life that they were dedicated towards. And of course, we've made great progress in having more flexibility and letting people choose which spheres they're more attracted to. Do they want to be more focused on life or work or life, right? But at the time that these ideal worker norms came about, it was more traditional, normative couple splitting, where a husband would go into the workforce and a wife would stay home. And the assumption was sort of that work can be number one at all times and other things aren't interrupting. And while we've evolved somewhat on that front, the world has changed much faster than our norms have. And so we're trying to cling on to this old norm of what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a good employee that just doesn't match the realities of the lives that employees live.
Completely agree, 100%. So, there is a lot of research out there. Your research is gold, and there's just so much out there that speaks, to what needs to happen. So why aren't leaders focusing on wellness? And if they do, how are they, as you like to say, treating it?
Yeah. So I think that leaders are sort of taking cues from what their organizations ask them to prioritize. And while workplaces have been investing more time and energy and attention into employee health and well-being, it's not what they ask their leaders to focus on. They ask their leaders to focus on results and the bottom line,
Right.
and making sure that, they're delivering on expectations. And because they're not asking leaders to see and framing these wellness initiatives or wellness focuses in as part of what does help drive those results, leaders view them as being at odds. And so they think, well, either I can make people happy and healthy or I can drive results. But when push comes to shove, I'm going to just try to be results focused, which often means, overwork, making people put the pedal to the metal, deprioritizing their lives, which we all know is a recipe for burnout and a lower level of productivity in the long term. But what they're trying to do is prioritize what they hear their workplace is saying. And workplaces are not often putting these two things in conversation with one another.
That was very crisp. So that brings us to then, what can we actually do as leaders to start to change the tide of the ship? And I love that in all the research that you do, and I love research too, this is great. You found at least two kinds of leaders. And I don't know if there were more in your research, but I'm interested, certainly what you talk about in the book, the generators and the extinguishers. So let's let our listeners and viewers understand what are those two leaders like.
Sure. Yeah. So in the research we did for the book, we asked people to nominate and discuss with us leaders they had who they felt were exemplary at supporting their wellness. And we did dozens of in-depth interviews, and then hundreds of people filled out surveys afterwards to sort of verify our findings, to try to understand who those people were and what they were doing. And we came up with the term generator because the leaders who we heard about who were exemplary at doing this tended to be leaders who really amplified the energy on their team, made people feel extra engaged at work, made people feel like their health was better than ever, physical health, mental health. So not only were they thriving in their workplaces, they were also feeling like their lives were improving, and that they were having a great level of work-life balance, that they actually were reaching a balance that was appropriate for them, that they felt in balance. And so all of those things led us to name these leaders, who we are providing a roadmap in our book for how to become more like, generators. The interesting thing about the process of doing the interviews and surveys for this book was that while we were asking people to really focus on, we don't want to know what not to do, because the presence of good leadership isn't just the absence of bad leadership. So we don't want this book to be a bunch of like, don't do this, right? We want it to be, what can you do to get yourself proactively great at this? And what we found in the interviews was that it was often challenging to keep people on track from talking about foils to this. So, we'd hear a lot of, let me tell you about this great leader that I had. This is what this person did in comparison to this horrible person that I had. And then they would go on and talk about and tell stories about these other folks. And what we started to realize was that the natural emergence of these stories about extinguishers, which we ended up calling them in the book, the extinguishers are really people who suck energy and life out of a team, and out of their employees. And we realized that one of the reasons these were organically occurring, stories about these folks were organically occurring, was because people really view the generators in opposition to, or they were highlighting a useful distinction for us that we actually found helpful in conveying these concepts in our book, which is, it's not just about avoiding being an extinguisher, which you also need to learn. It's about getting to being a generator, but you kind of need to understand the behaviors of both to get yourself to that place.
Mm-hmm. Gorgeous. So well said. When I was doing my meaning and work and identity research for my PhD, I started to recognize, as I was asking people about their identities, and I forget how it came up, but who people that they'd learned things from, I discovered what concept that I began to call the anti-role model. People would talk about, who they did not want to be like. Thanks very much for showing me who I don't want to be.
Yeah.
So listeners and viewers, let's just distinguish, from my vantage point, that the anti-role model would be the extinguisher.
Correct. Yes, that's correct. And I love that term, anti-role model, because you can, and these folks did, who we talked to, learned a lot from the people who they had negative experiences with, but it was a painful process, right? So learning was happening, but also some strife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we're now getting into the leadership and leader realm here. I think it makes a ton of sense, especially for people that are thinking this is really soft and squishy and, not a lot of substance here. Let's talk about the workplace wellness matters, how it actually matters. I know you've got at least 4 perspectives in the book, but let's hit those next.
Yeah. So we view workplace wellness as, well, obviously we wrote this book, so we feel really confident that workplace wellness is an important topic to focus on. But we also think about this not just from the perspective of individual employees, which is one level, which we've already talked about a little bit. People get more satisfied, they feel more engaged, they are more committed. So the quality of their experience at work improves, right? But there's also benefits in it for the leader themselves. And I think that that's something that often gets overlooked. We heard not only that the employees were feeling better, but also that leaders who lead this way actually have better experiences in their work lives and tend to leave behind better legacies that they can be more proud of. They also have teams that are willing to kind of stick with them, stand by them. They have stronger relationships with them. And as human beings, we want to have strong relationships with people across domains, whether that's work or in our personal lives. So the leaders actually end up having a better time. And then the last 2 have to do with organizational and societal implications. So when individuals and leaders are thriving and having better experiences and stronger relationships and feeling more productive and committed, that rises the tide of the organization. The organization overall becomes more productive. Bottom line goes up. They also become a better place to work. So easier to recruit and retain talent, but word of mouth goes a long way. People speak more positively, that net promoter score that folks sometimes talk about. So your organization looks better, feels better, does better. And the last piece, which is really what got Patricia and I into doing industrial organizational psychology to begin with, is that businesses can have a huge impact on society. And when we think about the responsibility that organizations have to produce healthy, whole citizens who have energy to give back to their communities and their families and their friends, that's something that can boost an entire area, an entire region, right? When you have good employers in that area, because if you're spitting out a bunch of people who are burnt out and irritated and frustrated and just want to roll up in a ball and go to bed at the end of the day versus people who want to get out of their workplace and have a great meal with family and friends and go coach their kids' sports team or whatever the case may be, that improves whole communities. And that's what we really think is great about unlocking these secrets, is that as a leader, you can see the ripple effects down, but you can also see the ripple effects out and up.
I really align with that, Katina. I'm a conscious capitalist, and my business books are certainly grounded in conscious capitalism.
Yes.
And even if we just, forget about all the amazing bottom line results that you're going to get by focusing on this, and you start to recognize that business can truly be a force for good in the world. It's so inspiring. And what we also know, Katina, is those kinds of organizations that behave that way, that perform in that way, tend to attract a lot more investors. They're interested, right? And then, of course, employees, as you were saying before, opt into that with their feet, and consumers opt in with their wallets. So there's a lot of reason to be able to start to incorporate this kind of thinking into the way that you operate as a business.
Totally.
Speaking of business, I got to ask you about yours, and if you got to start with why you named it Worker Being. It's so fantastic. So tell us about Worker Being, how it came to be, and what you're doing.
Yeah. So Patricia and I are friends from graduate school. We met while we were doing our PhDs in industrial organizational psychology. And we both studied sort of similar things that had to do with what helps employees and workplaces to thrive. She studied more emotions at work and the expression of emotions at work. I studied more on the diversity and inclusion side of things, but we were both interested in the same end goal. We stayed in touch as friends after graduation, close touch. And I went into academia and she went into practice. And we ended up at a friend's wedding. And after a couple of glasses of wine, we were talking about some of the things that were kind of frustrating us about what we were hearing from students and clients. And one of those things was that we felt like there wasn't a lot of translation of the science of workplace wellness into the actual workplace, right? And so we knew there was all this great research out there that we had learned in graduate school, but we were still noticing that our students and our clients were asking us very basic questions for which there was like decades of research on to answer those questions. And that was making us realize that this information must not be very accessible to the average employee. So we started thinking about why that was. And one of the main reasons is because, well, first of all, you need training to decipher these academic articles where a lot of this research sits. And second, they're behind a paywall. And so if your organization doesn't have access to these things, which most don't, it's really challenging to get your hands on that. So you're always reading a synthesis or other people's take on the research as opposed to the source. And that can sort of muddy the waters, right? So our initial idea with Worker Being was, let's start a blog where we take different topics that we know the research on, and we make them very accessible, and we link to other places that are not behind a paywall where people might be able to actually access some of this data and start spreading the word that way. And once people caught on to the blog, they suggested that maybe we start a podcast because people don't always like to read. They also like to listen. So we did that. And then as we were doing those two things, we noticed that people kept asking us a lot for actions. So yeah, I really believe in the power of workplace wellness, and I like what you're both doing. I'm a leader. Give me a roadmap. Give me an action plan. And when we went to the literature to look for that, that was one of the first times we got kind of stumped. There wasn't really anything out there that provided that. So we decided at that point to pivot and do some of our own original research, which is what produced the book. And to round out the answer, why do we call it Worker Being? We think the idea of a worker bee is a well-known concept that you're sort of just this, put your head down, cog in a wheel. And we want people to shift their focus away from employees being worker bees to thinking about their well-being. So Worker Being was born.
Gorgeous. I love it. Okay, and on that note, let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Dr. Katina Sawyer, an associate professor of management and organizations in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona, also co-founder of Worker Being and co-host of the Thriving at Work podcast. We've been talking about what is workplace wellness, why it's important and why you should care about it. After the break, we're going to get into teaching you about some of these generator behaviors leaders can develop and embrace to create that kind of a workplace for your organization. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As I too am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world, I continue to research and write my own books. So my last one came out in 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand what we've been talking about in this program, how the world, the workforce has changed. And what do you need to do as an organization in your culture to address that, to provide that? So then I provide you 22 best practices to equip you to put that into your culture so that they will stay with you and actually thrive. You can find my books on Amazon or on my personal site, elisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Dr. Katina Sawyer, the co-author of Leading for Wellness: How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives. So now let's get through as many as we can in the time that we have here. I want to talk about these beautiful generator behaviors that leaders can develop. So one of the things that we do on this program is we educate and we also inspire. So I always want people to leave the show with actionable things they can start to do and fold into their practice. So let's talk about as many of these as we can. So I'll start with the first one, which I can't resist. You say that generator behaviors that show that humans, leaders are actually human beings and not superhuman. So therefore, that requires that they must fire their work self.
Yeah. We really couch this going back to that concept of ideal worker norms. So many of us take on work personas that we've adapted and adopted from people we've seen. You mentioned, role models, anti-role models. Who do you want to be like? Who do you not want to be like? However, often the things that we've sort of embodied are subconscious. We might be promoting norms that we haven't even thought through. And we might be setting a tone that we're not even consciously aware of, or that we haven't selected ourselves. We sort of pass down the behaviors that we see from other people. We don't often think about how much they're really us. And so the idea of firing your work self is really taking some contemplative time to think about who you are and how you show up at work, and whether that's genuinely and authentically you, or whether that's a set of norms and behaviors that you've picked up along the way that don't really reflect how you want to lead. And so when we say fire your work self, we mean really thinking hard about who your work self is, whether that aligns with your true self, and firing the parts that are not authentic to you and beginning to lead from a place of centeredness around your individuality.
Totally in for that. This next one, I think, is probably going to make a few people cringe just a little bit, and yet it's so important. And that's the idea of embracing your struggle.
Yes. Yeah. So we got this idea from the participants in our study, but also an anecdote from my personal life. An academic who I admire so much told me about a practice that she does called an anti-resume, which is basically putting all the things. She's very decorated many accolades. And her students were saying, I just don't know how I can be you. Like, you win at everything. You're just successful all the time. And she really took that to heart and thought, you know what? I'm going to make a list of all the things I've failed at. Every grant I applied for that I didn't get. Every class I taught where my ratings weren't great. Every journal article that I submitted that got rejected. And I'm going to give that to my students along with my resume. And that line of thinking really has always resonated with me from early in my career, that we don't see a lot of these struggle statements from people who have been successful, who are in leadership roles. And so people just assume that they're not struggling, that things just come easily to them, that they don't have any worries or fears. And what we, have found out in this idea that people don't want superhero leaders is that when you share your struggles, it actually creates stronger and more authentic bonds with other people around you, because they're struggling with things too. And instead of sort of highlighting that there's something wrong with you, you're actually highlighting that there's a commonality between you and the people who you're leading. So you're thinking you're pointing out something negative about yourself. Really what you're showing is that you all share in the fact that you're not perfect. And that creates really strong, authentic bonds, but it also motivates people to think that they can also be leaders. Because if you think that leaders have to be perfect and you know that you're not perfect, you may not try to be a leader because you don't see that as a possible outcome for you. So not only is it helpful for building these relationships, but it's also helpful for making sure that the people who you're trying to cultivate and mentor actually see leadership as a viable option for them.
I love that. And also, in addition, it occurs to me that practice of showing your struggles and what you've dealt with and how you've grown through them, what that does is it creates a learning culture, right? We learn, we grow here. That's how we do here. And I really like that. I have a woman in that she's a leader that I've been coaching for years as within the organization that I work with. And she has this thing where this is related to both the first two behaviors. She says she's developed this pattern of saying, this is me being vulnerable. And then she goes on to say something that she's struggling with. Mm-hmm. It works beautiful because as soon as she says that, one, people are leaning in and listening.
Yes.
And two, she's just opened this beautiful space between them. So it's kind of a combination of the first two generator behaviors. But
I love that.
Isn't that beautiful? And then, having struggle statements. I know in the book, you talk about developing actual struggle statements that show others that you have weaknesses at work too. I think I think there's so much there because people look at you like, wow, they're the big VP or they're the CEO, whatever. And, but they didn't start that way.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Some of the best conversations that I've seen are panels that I've seen with very senior people in organizations are panels where they're really honest about the sacrifices and struggles that they've had. I saw a panel early on in my career where someone asked the question of, what do you struggle with most? And I watched 3 executives in a row say something to the effect of, I just think I'm the type of person who was made for this sort of thing. And just deflected, didn't want to say any struggle. And finally, there was a woman at the end of the panel and she said, I'll tell you exactly what I've struggled with. I've struggled with a lot, named a bunch of struggles. And you could feel the whole audience just like a sigh of relief. And the questions that got asked after that, the questions that she got from the audience in the Q&A were very different from the questions that the other people got, because people are like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to hear real information as opposed to like a canned talk track that I think sometimes we develop as leaders.
Yeah. Teflon, be Teflon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So next behavior for generators that we want to develop, ladies and gentlemen, setting the right tone.
Yeah. So we are taught, and, I'm guilty of this too in my own career. Patricia and I have talked about this. We're taught that the measure of productivity and performance and success is how much time you spend working. And that's sort of beaten into us from an early age that time matters. So we see all these time-based behaviors, people sending emails extremely early, extremely late. I had a friend who worked for a company where they installed nap pods as part of a wellness initiative, and people used it to sleep at work to show that, they were actually never leaving, right? So there are, these signals that people try to send that they're putting in the most time. And what these leaders do is they understand that time is not really the most important metric. The most important metric is not how long you're doing something for, but how well you're doing something. And so they focus a lot more on the quality of experience that employees are having, which produces a higher quality level of work. So setting a positive team tone, recognizing employees for the work that they do, making sure that people have appropriate levels of balance. These are all things that come back to you and actually end up saving the team time. So many leaders tell us that they don't have time to think about the tone because they're always putting out fires and things are always going wrong. Well, when you set a good tone, the people on the team don't feel like they constantly have to come to you to solve all their problems. They help each other solve problems. The environment becomes more collaborative. The product quality goes up, right? So all of these things are related, and the mindset shift away from time to tone is something that we heard over and over again that these leaders are doing really well. And then they have more time to spend thinking about the higher level problems and issues that they have to solve for instead of constantly running around and squashing everyone's little problems.
Mm-hmm. This is not quite the same thing, but there's a tangential relationship here. I wrote about this in my book, The Great Revitalization, is we need to move away from management by presenteeism. Can I see you? To management by productivity. What is your output?
Yes.
And it might be that that same output gets done in 6 hours instead of 9 or 10. But back to the quality piece of it. And I think that is a crucial, critical next step to get us to focus on that, to get us away from these outdated practices of how we've been managing employees to really this newer, more productive, conscious, elevated way that I think is really merited for today's times.
Yeah, agreed. And that deliverables focused culture is important. The thing that now we're struggling with is that, once somebody gets something done in 6 hours that could have taken 9, they're like, oh, great, you have an extra 3 hours. Now do this other thing, right? So you also have to realize and we'll get more into this later, the joy in allowing your employees to have a life, that if they finish their work, and that's not an excuse to pile more on, that you can actually let them then take that time to replenish themselves from what was probably a lot of hard focused work that they did for that period of time.
Mm-hmm. And to take into consideration, there's a lot of research out there that I've been seeing that indicates how traditionally employees that have been, the ones that were full-time in the office, they would spend a lot of time in the office, but they were also spending a considerable amount of time planning their vacations at work, handling their social calls, et cetera, at work. So if we're more expedient and focused in actually what we're producing, and therefore it seems to take less time, I think it would be really interesting to see, are we really comparing apples to oranges or apples to apples here?
100%. Yeah. If anybody tells you that they can focus hard for 8 straight hours and do that repeatedly day after day, they are lying.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. We call that fibbing from the town that I came from.
Yeah.
Okay, let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Katina Sawyer, an associate professor of management and organizations in the Ehlers College of Management at the University of Arizona, co-founder of Worker Being, and the co-host of the Thriving at Work podcast. We've been talking about a few of the generator behaviors that you can develop as a leader to start to create an organization that's thriving and that promotes wellness. After the break, we're gonna cover off on a few more. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my last book came out, The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I created a very simple 3-page organizational assessment that will help you determine the extent to which your current culture is meeting the needs of today's discerning workforce. It's 3 pages. You can find it at gusto-now.com. If you are just joining us, my guest is Dr. Katina Sawyer, co-author of Leading for Wellness, How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives. So let's talk about this. We're going to continue on and get through as many of these generator behaviors as we can. I love this next one. It's just so crisp, or swiftly becoming a confidant.
Yes. Yeah. So in this portion of the book, we talk about the fact that leaders who are quite good at building strong relationships focus on them from the beginning and invest the time and energy up front in those relationships. Doesn't mean that you can't go backwards if you haven't done this already with other people, but as you onboard new people, thinking about how you invest the time up front to really quickly build a strong connection. And so we came with this idea of SWIFT. And so SWIFT is all about setting aside time, to dedicated time to really have meetings with employees where you don't talk about work. You talk about things that are important to them outside of life. You're creating a welcoming environment where they feel comfortable to speak with you. So you're not sitting behind the desk being all rigid. You're inquiring about things that matter to them, asking a lot of questions so you can learn more about who they are as people and what matters to them and what motivates them. And then you're following up on the things that you learned. You're bringing them back up in conversation, asking them about things that they mentioned. So if they mention that and their children are extremely important to them and there are certain activities, maybe their son is excellent at violin, the next time you see that person saying, how are things going with the violin with your son? And, bringing up things that you share in common, little things like that go a long way. And then finally, reflecting, taking time to think about, okay, based on everything that I know about the people on my team, how can I make my leadership even better? How can I facilitate creating a motivating environment or a more connected environment, given the information that I've garnered through these SWIFT meetings?
Mm-hmm. I really embrace that too, of course. There's nothing in your book that I don't embrace. But, I remember I've taught over the years, so many supervisors, first time that they've managed people, then managers and leaders and senior leaders. And one of the things I've always said over the years is just how critical it is to develop the capacity to really go looking for and seeing and celebrating your people. There's something so beautiful and magical when people feel seen, really seen for who they are and celebrated for it. Not just, I tolerate you, I see you, but you're amazing. I see how special and the unique human that you are walking the planet.
100% agree. Yeah. And you can't really celebrate those things if you don't know what they are. So asking those kinds of questions can help you get that information.
Yeah. I don't think it counts that we can celebrate. Oh, look, you're breathing. That's so cool.
Right. Yeah. Agreed.
Okay. This next one is really, really near and dear to my heart, Katina. Be elastic. Your way isn't always right. And the reason I want to start with or situate that way is I know how easy it is. When you're wet, this works really great for me. Wonderful. You're not the only me in the room, especially not on your full team. So if you could expand on this generator behavior, be elastic.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, particularly for leaders, we think that what got us to this position is going to be exactly what gets other people to this position. And the reality is that different people work in different ways, and both of your ways, if you're thinking about an employee who you're mentoring, can be equally effective while looking quite different. And we saw a lot in the Extinguisher camp of leaders being like, do it this way. You need to do it this way. I worked with someone who an interview question that they used to ask was, if you found out that a very successful person structured their day this way, what would you do with that information? And if you gave the answer in the interview anything other than I would also structure my day exactly that way, that was considered a wrong answer in the interview. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about here. There's not one way to success. And it's great for you to share what's helped you get to be where you are. And maybe that will resonate with other people. But the expectation that people have to do it exactly the way that you've done it is really putting people in a box that's not aligning with their personal preferences and what's going to make them most successful.
100% agree. Now, related to that, this is really fresh for me. I guess I knew this intuitively, but I've never seen anybody distinguish it this way. You describe how people approach work either as segmenters or integrators in terms of how they fit work and life together.
Yeah. So this is a term that came from the research and not from our research, from other folks' research that we saw coming up again and again in our research that seemed to matter for how generators were managing their employees. So integrators are folks who like to intersperse work and life activities across the course of the day. That means that their workday is usually longer because they're taking time out in the middle of the day to do life activities. And they don't find any hindrance in switching back and forth between life and work tasks. They like it that way. Segmenters are different. Segmenters are people who say, I'm starting my workday at whatever time and my workday ends at this time, and interruptions really throw them. They like to be in one headspace and then shift to another headspace. So they're much more bothered by sick person in their household who keeps interrupting them during work time, or a boss who calls them outside of work hours, right? That throws them off much more. Neither of these is better or worse than the other. They both can be equally productive. The problem is that people often expect that the way they would do things is the way that other people should do things. So an integrator who, has spent their day sprinkling in other life activities and then reaches out to a coworker on their team at 6 p.m. who's a segmenter and says, hey, can we talk for a few minutes? Is going to get annoyed when that person says, no, I'm not available, but we can talk tomorrow morning, right? Thinking that they're not maybe as dedicated or on the job. The reality is that person may have put in more time during the day than that person did, and they're just being good about setting their boundaries. So a first step or an entry point into understanding these two ways of operating is to ask the question, to get a sense of who on your team operates this way, and then to recognize that your way is not the best way. So the same idea of being elastic, right? Just because you're an integrator or segmenter doesn't mean everybody else has to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's helpful. And I know that I've heard many people have been a little bit surprised. The simple idea of, what's the golden rule? Treat others as you would like to be treated, except that's not good enough. You need the platinum rule, which is, treat others as they wish to be treated. That's another level of understanding and engagement. Yes. So important not to assume just because it works for you, that will work for them. And I'm an integrator. So I can appreciate that. And
Me too.
Part of my team are segmenters, and I totally appreciate that and applaud that. But I really liked how crisp it is that you've given me this terminology to be able to distinguish that. It's just gorgeous.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So you mentioned boundaries before, and this next one I thought was really powerful when it comes to really cultivating wellness in an organization, the idea of becoming a boundary bouncer.
Yeah. So we were thinking about what's the right imagery for this. And one of the things that kept coming up for us was this idea of a bouncer at a club, and there's a velvet rope, and you've said, this is my boundary. This is my non-negotiable. I won't take a work call during my daughter's soccer practice, right? Like, I want to be really present for that. And unfortunately, what we see in a lot of the stories about extinguishers is that the extinguisher will say, oh yeah, no, totally, that makes sense. And then they'll text or call during that time period and say, I know that you said that you don't like to take calls right now, but it's just going to take a few minutes. Or, they're constantly breaking these boundaries that employees are asking them to uphold. And so we like the vision of thinking of yourself standing as a leader with this velvet rope, and your employees are back there, and you're trying to figure out, okay, who gets let through, right? Who are we going to say is okay to break these boundaries, and being very judicious about that. So let's say you feel better in your wellness. I know for me, my eyes start to hurt if I stare at a screen for too long. So taking a little screen break is very helpful for me in being able to continue to be productive in my day. So let's say someone has that and they say, I would love to, be able to get away from the computer and take a walk every day from 12 to 12:30. And if I could hold that time sacred on my calendar, it'll make me much more productive later in the afternoon. The leader would make sure that other people on the team respect that boundary. If there's a non-urgent or even, an urgent but could be done at a different time that day, meeting that comes across their desk that employee needs to be in, they would make sure that people are not trampling over that or encourage the employee to hold that time. However, let's say there's a client call that's happening and the only time the client can make it is noon on Thursday. And so for this one time, you might have to take your walk at 1 instead of noon. The leader might say, okay, velvet rope for this one instance. That can't repeat over and over again, right? But being really clear about making sure that the default is upholding the boundary. You're not really allowed in here. This is a VIP area, as opposed to the default being like the velvet rope's open and just run on in.
Yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. When people feel like the leader is protecting them, really cares about their well-being, their wellness, and they recognize, when somebody from another department calls and says, "Hey, I really need you to get this report out." Actually, no, they don't.
Yeah,
Is there room for us to get this to you tomorrow, kind of thing,
exactly.
right? And I think that's just such a really crisp, fresh perspective, Katina. Just really good stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, now let's talk about the next generator behavior, the power of person-centered planning.
Yeah. So this is sort of at the heart of a lot of things that we talk about in the book, but we put it at the end because it's one of the meatier concepts, and you kind of need to work up some of the other skills to be able to engage in this well. But the idea is that you're tailoring your approach to the individual employees who are on your team and trying to avoid blanket solutions. And what this means is that the idea of person-centered planning is a Rogerian idea from the psychology literature, where it's been used in therapy, where you're listening to someone with non-judgmental, positive regard about what is important to them, what they'll need to feel in balance. And you're using these skills of, recognizing that your way is not always the way, and building these swift connections in order to really facilitate a positive process. But the idea is that the employee feels comfortable sharing with you things that are getting in their way of being productive at work, things that would be really helpful for them to be productive at work, things that would be helpful for them in their lives, right, to feel more whole and happy as human beings, and that you're really listening to and gathering that information and using that information kind of like a map of how to support that employee, and then looking across the employees who you support and understanding what can you do to create an environment where they're all most likely to thrive. And that might mean meeting people where they are with certain things. And that might also mean like, hey, win for me. Everybody said that they would love for us to take a 15-minute mindfulness break at 3 p.m. every day. So we're going to try to do that, So there are certain things that might work for everybody, and there are certain things that might work only for one person or two people. So trying to be as much as possible, no world is perfect, and nobody's going to get every single one of their needs checked off, right? But to the extent that you can, trying to tailor your approach to your team can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. And that, again, that takes, that time, that just focusing on the person, the relationship development, as we talked about before, all those things that are so important. And what I want to emphasize here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the more you incorporate these behaviors into yourself as a leader, the more all your relationships across your life are going to improve. Everything's going to get better when you incorporate this across your life. So it's just beautiful. It goes that ripple effect we were talking about before.
100%.
So we're coming to the end of the show, and you have a chapter here on leaders embracing the idea of eliminating mental health stigma, which we don't have time to go into, but I want to situate that as also an important thing, that they got to take a stand for that to really make this work well. And then also, as you incorporate and start to embrace these behaviors, especially in an organization that doesn't naturally have them, you're going to get backlash and you're going to get pushback. So Katina and Patricia have some great stuff in their book, and I'm sure on their podcast and in their consulting, to help you with that, navigate those waters. So I just want to situate that, we want to round this up, because we recognize that you becoming this human being that we're talking about, encouraging you to become, you will face resistance from those who don't understand it and who haven't quite gotten there yet.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we do provide some strategies for navigating what if you're housed in a toxic work culture, or what if you don't have a lot of champions that think that this is a good idea, or what if you're getting burnout trying to, tailor these solutions to everybody on the team, and you're feeling like it's taking a lot of your time and energy. How can you streamline things, and how can you replenish your own energy?
Mm-hmm. It's greatness. Well, as you can see, I'm a fan. I'm certainly happy to evangelize this. I'm so happy to meet you, Katina. I'm so grateful that this all worked out, that you and I got to meet as well. I look forward to meeting Patricia as well.
Yes.
I think you probably know by now that this show is listened to by people around the world who really are either trying to cultivate their own leadership acumen, prowess, or they're trying to learn, how to become better in their own career, or maybe even they're leaders that are trying to create those organizations that better the world. What would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, I think that if we could summarize things in one sentence, it would be that wellness is not a program or a Band-Aid. Wellness is about the day-to-day experiences that your employees have. So if you really think about how to cultivate positive and uplifting and supportive day-to-day experiences that match people's wellness needs, you're going to do a lot better than throwing spaghetti at the wall with a wellness budget and putting a bunch of programs in place that you're not sure what's going to stick.
Beautiful way to finish, Katina. Not surprised. All right. So listener, thank you so much for being on, Katina. It's just really a delight. Just a great, wonderful surprise that I got to talk to you.
Awesome.
All right. So listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Katina Sawyer and also her co-author, Dr. Patricia Grayberick, their podcast, the work they do at Worker Being. So start by visiting their website. It's Worker Being. Let me spell it for you because it's a little bit of a different spelling on both. Worker is WORKR, no E. Being, BEING, two E's, BEING.com. So workerbeing.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with Tanielle Miller talking about her book, The Flourishing Effect, Unlocking Employee Thriving and High Performance as Your Competitive Advantage. It was an incredibly educational and inspiring conversation. One important thing I took from our conversation is that in a time when 70% of the workforce is disengaged, Tanielle helped us understand that people don't choose to disengage from work, deciding to wake up and spend most of their day in a state of boredom, frustration, anxiety, stress, and alienation just to earn a paycheck. Rather, disengagement is a coping mechanism any healthy human would employ to avoid the cognitive dissonance or mental discomfort of having to function in an environment where they find themselves unsafe, stifled, or in an otherwise warped experience of reality. In other words, there is so much we can do to create environments and work experiences to help people thrive at work that are not present today in most workplaces. Next we'll be on air with Robert Bordoni and Joel Salinas talking about their powerful new book, Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, a toolkit for coming together in a conflicted world. See you then. And remember, work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave and can give us the opportunity to do business in a way that betters the world. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.